The chest pain struck again, sharp and ruthless, as a shard of glass slicing straight into my heart. I collapsed onto the cold bathroom floor, hurriedly stuffing a rolled-up towel into my mouth to muffle my groans. Cold sweat drenched my forehead as I used my trembling hands to tip the heart medication bottle upside down. It was completely empty. I had snapped the last pill in half 2 days ago to make it last. The doctor said I was in end-stage heart failure. He told me I needed to be hospitalized immediately, that I needed a medical miracle and an astronomical amount of money to stay alive. But in this rundown suburban slum, miracles were a luxury that destitute people like my daughter and me had no right to dream of. I tossed the empty bottle into the trash and hid the crumpled medical record. I would rather die in silence than let my daughter know her father was about to become a lifeless corpse. Gripping the sink, I struggled to my feet. The rotting wooden walls of our diner creaked mournfully in the cold night wind. Through the crack in the door, I looked out into the main room. My heart, already constricting from illness, felt as if it were being crushed to pieces at the sight. My Clara had fallen asleep at the table. She had just turned 22, an age when other girls were dressing up for college lectures, going on dates, and enjoying their radiant youth. But Clara's youth was buried in the acrid smell of grease in a shabby kitchen, beneath a filthy apron, her hands crisscrossed with chapped cracks from washing dishes. Since her mother passed away, the burden of keeping this little diner afloat had fallen entirely on her narrow shoulders. She dropped out of school, working herself to the bone from the crack of dawn until late at night, exhausting herself just to buy me painkillers and pay off exorbitant interest rates. On the rickety wooden table where Clara rested her head, the dim yellow light cast a glow over a thick stack of bills, stamped with Richard's red foreclosure signatures. Richard was no ordinary creditor. He was a cold-blooded predator in the real estate underworld. He knew this tiny diner sat right on a golden plot of land, slated for redevelopment, and he used every dirty trick, every sky-high interest loan, to back us into a corner. But what disgusted and terrified me the most was the way he looked at Clara. He didn't just want to steal my late wife's final legacy. He wanted to push my daughter to the brink, forcing her to sign a contract, selling herself as his mistress. A dry cough rose in my throat, and I quickly covered my mouth. Looking closer at where Clara was sleeping, my eyes stung, and tears spilled over uncontrollably. Today was the 7th. Today was Clara's birthday. There was no cake, no ribbon-tied gifts, no friends singing to her. Placed neatly beside the stack of debt bills was a piece of dry, dark bread, topped with a cheap candle that had long since burned out. She must have lit the candle herself, sung happy birthday to herself in this dark, freezing room, and then collapsed from sheer exhaustion. I dragged my heavy feet out of the bathroom, took off my frayed coat, and draped it over her shivering, frail shoulders. "I'm sorry. I am so sorry, Clara," I whispered through a blur of tears. I was a failure. A useless man who couldn't protect his late wife's life's work, nor give his only daughter a single decent day. I was just an old, diseased tumor, daily draining the last bit of life from my child. How many nights had I stood on the edge of the bridge, staring down at the rushing water, yearning to throw myself in and end it all. If I died, maybe Clara's burden would lighten. Maybe she could just sell this plot of land, pay off the debt, and find a way out. But I didn't dare to die. I was terrified that if I closed my eyes forever, the darkness named Richard would instantly swallow her whole. I had to live, even if it meant merely clinging to my last breaths, to act as a rotting shield, protecting Clara from the hungry wolves outside. Tonight, the winter cold cut to the bone. I sat in the chair opposite her, rubbing her freezing hands, begging God for a miracle. Anything at all, please just save this pure-hearted child. And then, just as I was drowning in the darkest, despair a heavy, dull thud shattered the silence. Bam! Someone had just collapsed right in front of our diner's door. The harsh crash, mixed with the howling of the winter wind, made me jump. Clara woke with a start. She looked up from the pile of bills in a daze, her eyes heavily bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Dad!" "What was that?" she rasped, her voice hoarse. "Stay there, Clara." I signaled for her to step back behind the counter. The instinct of a father in a slum full of danger instantly flared up. I grabbed a rusty iron wrench from the corner and slowly crept toward the front door. Outside, a freezing blizzard had begun to fall. I cracked open the rotting wooden door, and a blast of icy wind hit my face, making me stumble. Under the sickly yellow glow of a flickering street lamp, the large figure of a man lay face down in a muddy puddle right on our porch. He was soaked to the bone, shivering violently. He looked like a corpse washed ashore from a storm. His clothes were disheveled, torn to shreds, covered in mud and bleeding scratches. I gripped the wrench tighter, my guard up to the absolute limit. In this part of town, reckless pity often cost you your life. This stranger could be a thief, a junkie, or worse, a thug sent by Richard to pull some dirty trick. I was about to slam the door shut and leave the wretched man to his fate. But just then a muffled, rattling sound came from his chest. Wheeze, wheeze. It was the agonizing sound of gasping for breath, the sound of failing lungs fighting for every ounce of air. My own chest suddenly ached. That sound, it was exactly like my own labored breathing during the nights when my heart failure tormented me. He was slowly dying in the cold, just as I was slowly dying from my illness. "Dad, he's freezing to death." Clara was standing right behind me. Without a second of hesitation, she squeezed past me, ignoring the man's filthy state, and used her thin arms to try and drag him under the awning. "Clara, don't. It's too dangerous," I snapped, pulling her arm back. "We don't know who he is. Call the cops, then lock the door." "Dad, look at him. He's passed out. If we wait for the cops, he'll freeze to death." Clara's eyes met mine, unwavering and clear, without a trace of fear. "How can we sleep in peace, knowing a man died right on our doorstep?" Her words pierced my old heart like a needle. When my wife was alive, she had those exact same kind, stubborn eyes. I sighed, dropped the wrench, and stepped forward to help her hoist the stranger inside. He was incredibly heavy, his whole body as cold as ice. We propped him up against the corner wall. Through his blue lips, he managed to whisper that he had been robbed of his papers, beaten, and had been wandering and starving for 3 days. His name was Alexander. Clara rushed into the kitchen. I knew full well there was nothing left in the cupboards. We didn't even have money to buy ingredients to open the diner tomorrow. There was only a tiny handful of rice at the bottom of the barrel that Clara had planned to use to make thin porridge for my breakfast, and yet, 10 minutes later, she brought out a steaming, hot bowl of porridge. It was our entire remaining food supply. "Eat this. It will warm you up." Clara gently spoon-fed the stranger, completely forgetting that today was her birthday, and she had only eaten a dry crust of bread. Watching this, my chest felt tight and bitter. On one hand, I was endlessly proud to have raised a daughter with a heart of gold. On the other, the guilt was unbearable. How agonizing the kindness of the poor truly is. We were using our own flesh and blood, our very survival, to shelter another wretched soul. Alexander shakily took the bowl. He devoured it as if he hadn't eaten in a lifetime, but the corners of his eyes turned red. He looked at Clara, then at me, his gaze flashing with a complex emotion I couldn't read at the time. I will never forget this, Grace," Alexander said softly, his voice deep and strangely sincere. After eating, he regained some strength. He bowed deeply, begging me to let him stay the night, because the blizzard outside had grown fierce. Clara's kindness was one thing, but a father's duty to protect his daughter was another. I couldn't let a fully grown man of unknown origins sleep under the same roof as my 22-year-old daughter. "You can stay," I said coldly, pointing toward the backyard. "There's an old woodshed in the corner of the garden. It's leaky and damp, but at least you won't be buried by the snow. Tomorrow morning, when the snow melts, you leave immediately." "Dad," Clara tried to object because the shed was freezing, but I glared at her to stay silent. Alexander didn't take offense. On the contrary, he nodded repeatedly, his eyes full of gratitude. After handing him an old blanket, I watched his broad back disappear behind the door of the dilapidated shed. Immediately, I went back into the main house, drew all the curtains, and triple-locked both the front and back doors. That night, I stayed awake, tightly gripping the iron wrench, occasionally coughing violently. I had no idea that Clara's decision to open the door tonight hadn't just saved a vagrant's life, but had unknowingly opened the door to destiny, entirely altering the bleak trajectory of our lives. The next morning, the blizzard had passed. The weak winter sun cast pale rays through the grease and dust-covered windows of the diner. I unlocked the 3 deadbolts, gripping the wrench, convinced the vagrant had either left or worse, frozen to death in the shed. But no. Alexander was standing in the middle of the yard, rhythmically swinging an axe to chop damp firewood. He was back in his torn coat, sweating despite the freezing cold. Seeing me, he stopped and bowed respectfully. "I know you want me to leave," Alexander said, his voice deep and steady. "But I have nowhere to go. Please let me stay. I don't need a salary. I'll do anything: clean, wash dishes, fix things. Just give me your leftovers and a spot in the shed to sleep, please." I frowned, ready to refuse. This diner was on the verge of bankruptcy. Where would we get the food to feed another mouth? But just then, Clara walked out. She looked at the neatly chopped pile of wood, then at Alexander's red, freezing hands. "Let him stay, Dad. Our place is falling apart lately, and I can't climb onto the roof to fix the leaks," she pleaded softly. I sighed and reluctantly nodded. After all, having another man in the house offered a slight sense of security, especially when Richard could storm in at any moment. However, the survival instincts and paranoia of an old father didn't allow me to drop my guard. All day, I sat at the cash register, quietly observing Alexander, and I noticed some very strange details. He claimed to be destitute, but the way he ate exuded an indescribable calm and neatness. Most telling were his hands. Though covered in mud and swollen from the cold, they were long and slender, the nails neatly trimmed. Those were absolutely not the hands of a manual laborer or a homeless man who had been wandering for months. There were no calluses on his palms, none of the rough coarseness of the underclass. Yet, his actions completely contradicted his fallen aristocrat appearance. He didn't shy away from any task. He dove into cleaning the foul-smelling garbage out back, used his bare hands to pull out hair and grease-clogged filth from the drains. He climbed onto the creaky roof in the biting wind to patch up the holes. By the afternoon, the back pain and chest tightness returned to torture me. I stumbled toward the corner, aiming to collapse into my broken, 3-legged wooden chair that I usually propped up with a brick. But as I sat down, the chair didn't wobble or let out its terrifying creak. It was sturdy and comfortable. I looked down. The broken leg had been nailed and braced with a new piece of wood, sanded smooth so it wouldn't scratch the floor. A neatly folded thin blanket had been placed over the backrest. I looked up and saw Alexander quietly scrubbing the kitchen floor. He had done this secretly, a wordless gesture of refined care that made the defensive walls in my heart begin to crack. But that brief peace didn't last long. The next afternoon, the roar of an engine ripped through the quiet of our slum. A gleaming black Mercedes screeched to a halt in front of the diner. The sound of pointed leather shoes crunched against the cold dirt. The diner's door was kicked open. Richard walked in. He wore an expensive overcoat, a half-lit cigar in his mouth, the smell of cheap cologne mixing with thick, nauseating tobacco smoke. Behind him were two massive, scarred bodyguards. "It's the eighth old man." Richard slammed his silver-tipped cane onto the table, jutting his chin at me. "Where's this month's interest?" I leaned against the counter, trying to stand straight despite the stabbing pain in my chest. "Richard, you know business has been dead. Give me 3 more days. Just 3 days." 3 days, he chuckled a sinister, predatory laugh. "My time is money, old man. How much of my time do you think this rat hole is worth?" Just then, Clara walked out of the kitchen carrying a pot of bone broth. It was our best dish, and our only hope to make a little money that afternoon. The moment the aroma hit the air, Richard scowled. "Grash." He swung his cane, ruthlessly sweeping the pot of soup onto the floor. Boiling broth splashed everywhere. "Ah!" Clara shrieked in pain as the scalding liquid splashed across the back of her hand, instantly turning her pale skin blistered and red. "Clara," I screamed, lunging forward to hold my daughter. Fury rushed to my brain, and I grabbed the meat cleaver off the table, ready to fight him to the death. But before I could take a step, an agonizing pain shot through my heart, and my lungs seized. I collapsed into the puddle of hot soup, coughing violently, coughing so hard it felt like my internal organs would fly out. My vision blurred with tears and sheer helplessness. Richard looked down from above, his eyes full of contempt. He pulled a crumpled contract from his pocket and threw it onto the table. "Look at your pathetic state, old man. You're about to drop dead. What are you clinging to this shredded dignity for?" He leaned down, grabbed Clara by the chin, forcing her to look at him. "Sign this paper, sweetheart. Become my woman. Serve me well. The debt on this house will be wiped clean, and this old man might just have enough money to buy a decent coffin." "Don't touch me, you animal!" Clara violently slapped his hand away, tears streaming down her face, but her eyes burned with fierce defiance. Through the pain and humiliation, I cast my eyes toward the slightly ajar kitchen door. In the dark crack, I saw Alexander's silhouette. He was standing there, as stiff as an ice sculpture. But his eyes, those eyes, no longer belonged to a sickly vagrant. They surged with murderous intent, as dark and terrifying as a bottomless abyss. His hands gripped the wooden doorframe. He squeezed so hard that thick blue veins bulged on his forearms. Drip, drip. I saw blood. Alexander's fingernails had dug so deeply into his own palms that they pierced the flesh, causing drops of fresh blood to fall onto the cold floor. But he didn't step out. He gritted his teeth, biting his lip until it bled, choosing to stand completely still in the shadows to witness every ounce of our humiliation. That restraint was terrifying. What was he hiding? Why would a homeless man harbor such suppressed fury? The wooden frame beneath his hands began to splinter, signaling a massive storm silently taking form. A few days after the incident, our little diner settled back into a strangely quiet rhythm. Alexander was still there, working silently from dawn till dusk. He didn't say a word about Richard's appearance, nor did he ask why we had to endure such humiliation. He simply used scrap wood to quietly fix the battered door, and scrubbed every chipped bowl until it gleamed. Occasionally, when my coughing fits threatened to tear my chest apart, I would find a cup of warm water waiting on the table, alongside a few painkillers that I had no idea how he afforded. Clara seemed to open up more to this strange man too. She smiled when she saw him clumsily trying to start a fire, and sometimes I caught her stealing gentle glances at his broad back. Amidst the mud of despair, I naively thought that perhaps God had sent a good man to protect Clara after I was gone. But I was wrong. Poverty and desperation had blinded me, making me forget the cruelest rule of this world. There is no such thing as a free lunch. That afternoon, dark clouds gathered ominously in the sky, signaling a massive storm. The diner's door was kicked open once again. Richard entered. But this time, he lacked the arrogant swagger of a debt collector. On his face was a triumphant smirk, a twisted satisfaction, as if he had just found a highly entertaining new toy. "Good afternoon, old man," Richard hummed, stepping up to the register. He didn't look at me. His sharp eyes locked onto the kitchen corner where Alexander was quietly chopping onions. "And hello to our honored guest, hiding away in this rat hole." Alexander paused, the knife hovering in midair. The air in the diner instantly thickened, becoming suffocatingly tight. "What do you want now, Richard?" I growled, stepping in front of Clara. "I told you we need a few more days." "SHH," Richard pressed a finger to his lips, cutting me off. "I'm not here to collect a debt today. I'm here to be a good Samaritan. I'm here to open your eyes and your stupid daughter's eyes, so you can see exactly what kind of viper you've invited into your home." Saying that, he pulled a glossy financial magazine from his briefcase and slammed it onto the table. The cover featured a man in an impeccably tailored suit, his eyes razor-sharp, sitting in the leather chair of a massive corporate empire. The bold headline read, "Alexander Sterling, the young billionaire dominating global real estate." I froze. My old eyes blurred, then widened to their limits. The powerful man on that cover, even without the stubble and the mud-smeared face, had the exact same deep eyes, high nose bridge, and resolute features. There was no mistaking it. It was the vagrant currently washing dishes in our kitchen. "Surprise, right?" Richard burst into a screeching laugh that clawed at my eardrums. He pointed directly at Alexander, who had slowly stepped out of the kitchen, his face an emotionless mask. "This morning, when I went to Sterling Corp to negotiate a major project, my jaw nearly dropped when I realized the all-powerful CEO fighting me for a lucrative piece of the pie was the same cheap janitor in this dump." Clara took a step forward, her pale lips trembling, her hand, still bandaged from the burn, gripped the edge of the table. Is this some kind of joke, Alexander?" Alexander looked at Clara, a flash of confusion and pain crossing his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but Richard brutally cut him off. "A joke? You're too naive, little girl." Richard clapped his hands. "You think a billionaire has so much free time he'd pretend to be poor to come wash your dishes? No. His Sterling Corporation wants to acquire this entire block, to build a commercial center. He played the beggar to infiltrate your home, to scope things out, to find a way to steal this land without paying a single cent. He's been playing on your pity, you absolute fools." Crack! Thunder boomed outside, but it was nothing compared to the lightning bolt that had just struck my mind. The chest pain returned, fiercer and more savage than ever before. It felt as if a hand had reached into my chest and crushed my heart to a pulp. I staggered backward, crashing into the dish rack. The sound of shattering ceramics mixed with my rattling gasps. "Dad!" Clara screamed in horror, rushing over to catch my collapsing body. "Thomas!" Alexander panicked and lunged forward, reaching out to help me. "Don't touch my father!" Clara screamed, a gut-wrenching wail, piercing and filled with ultimate betrayal. She violently swatted Alexander's extended arm away, glaring at him. Tears poured down my little girl's hollow face. Alexander froze in midair. His eyes were red, his jaw clenched. "Clara, please let me explain. I didn't intend to steal this land. I just wanted to see if anyone in this world would treat me with kindness for who I am." Not for my money. I never wanted to deceive you. Looking for kindness. Clara let out a sobbing laugh, a distorted, utterly tragic sound. She pointed at the pile of debt, pointed at me, gasping for life on the floor, and held up her own blistered, cracked hands. Look. Look at the life we live. We starve, we freeze. We work ourselves to death every single day just to survive. And you have everything. And you use your power to play dress up as a poor man, trampling on our sincerity and our last scraps of food, just to satisfy your sick, ridiculous social experiment. Alexander stood in silence, every excuse choking in his throat. He realized that the carefree romance of the wealthy was a fatal knife, plunged into the last shreds of dignity of those at the bottom of society. Is our misery just entertainment for you rich people? Clara's voice shattered, cold and final. Get out. Get out of my house. I never want to see you again. I lay on the floor, my vision darkening from the heart attack. But before I passed out, I caught one last glimpse of Alexander's broad back. He didn't say another word. He bowed his head and walked out the door into the howling storm, taking with him the last bit of artificial warmth he had ever brought to this miserable family. I woke up to the smell of cheap antiseptic and the quiet darkness of the cramped bedroom behind the diner. My chest felt hollow and agonizing, as if the Grim Reaper had reached in, squeezed my heart, and then reluctantly let go just to force me to endure more earthly torture. By the edge of the bed, Clara had fallen asleep. Her face was visibly gaunter, her eye sockets swollen, tear streaks dried on her pale cheeks. The memory of that day rushed back like a nightmare. Alexander was gone. The billionaire who disguised himself as a beggar to test our hearts had been chased away. The diner had returned to its desolate state, but the trust and the flickering light in Clara's eyes were completely extinguished. Tonight was the third night since the truth came out. The wind howled through the cracks in the plywood walls. Suddenly, I heard a rattling metallic sound from the front door, like an iron chain clinking together. My survival instinct screamed that something was wrong, and I struggled to sit up. At the same moment, a sharp, pungent smell flooded my nose. Gasoline. Whoosh! A dull explosion rocked the building, and instantly, a massive fire erupted from outside, casting an eerie orange glow through the door cracks. In the blink of an eye, the rotting, grease-soaked wooden walls of the diner ignited like giant torches. Clara, wake up! Fire! I screamed, shaking my daughter frantically. Clara woke with a start, her eyes wide with terror, as she watched the plywood wall of the front room collapse into a sea of fire. Flames licked the ceiling, spitting out thick, suffocating black smoke. We rushed to the back door. She grabbed the doorknob and yanked with all her might, but it wouldn't budge. It's locked, Dad. Locked from the outside. Clara screamed in panic, banging her fists against the wooden door that was growing hotter by the second. Richard! That demon had lost his patience. He didn't just want to foreclose on the land. He wanted to wipe us out, burning both the deed and our lives to ash, so he could legally seize the property with no one left to object. The smoke thickened. I coughed violently, the acrid smell of burning wood and plastic invading my failing lungs, sending me to my knees. The fire had reached the kitchen. The old propane tanks could explode at any second. Hell was truly manifesting inside our home. Crack, boom. A wooden crossbeam on the ceiling, its core incinerated, suddenly snapped and plummeted straight toward us. Dad! I barely had the strength to shove Clara aside. A split second later, the blazing ironwood beam crashed down onto my legs. The sheer weight shattered my shin bones, and the blistering heat instantly set my clothes on fire, biting deep into my flesh. A feral scream tore from my throat. The pain was so absolute that my vision whited out. Dad! Dad, Clara sobbed hysterically, lunging forward, using her bare hands to try and lift the flaming beam. The skin on her hands instantly blistered and bled, but she refused to let go, tears pouring down her face. Stop it, Clara. I rasped with agonizing difficulty, blood seeping from the corner of my mouth. Go. The kitchen vent. You can fit, go now. No, I won't go. I can't leave you, she screamed in despair, frantically digging at the rubble around me. Listen to me. I roared with the very last ounce of my life force, tightly gripping her bleeding wrist and staring deep into her eyes. I have end-stage heart failure. Even if I don't burn to death, I won't survive this month. Don't let me die for nothing. You have to live, Clara. Live to escape this hell, go now. Clara froze. The secret I had hidden for so long was revealed in this tragic moment. She sobbed violently, shaking her head furiously, but the flames were nearing the gas tanks. There was no time. I grabbed a piece of broken glass from the floor and pressed it against my wrist. If you don't go, I will kill myself right here. Seeing the absolute resolve in my eyes, Clara let out a heart-shredding scream. She stumbled to her feet, backed away step by step, then turned and dashed toward the tiny ventilation window in the smoke-filled kitchen. Seeing my little girl's silhouette squeeze through the narrow gap and drop safely onto the grass outside, my heart finally relaxed. I closed my eyes. The scorching heat blasted my face. I had fulfilled my duty as a father. Now it was time for me to rest, to go see my late wife. But, just as I surrendered myself to the flames, crash! The heavy front door was obliterated by a massive force. Burning wood exploded in all directions. From the thick black smoke and sea of red fire, a towering figure charged in like an avenging god. It wasn't a vagrant in a ragged coat. This man wore a luxurious black suit, now singed and covered in soot. It was Alexander. Thomas, his roar overpowered the crackling of the flames. His eyes swept the inferno, and the moment he saw me pinned under the beam, he rushed over without a second of hesitation. He didn't call for help. He didn't flinch in fear. He dropped to one knee on the burning embers and shoved his broad shoulder directly underneath the blazing beam. "You're crazy," I rasped, staring at him in shock. "I told you I would do anything for this family," Alexander hissed through gritted teeth. And then, with terrifying strength, he pushed upward. The flames from the beam licked directly at his jacket, searing the flesh of his shoulder and neck, emitting the sickening smell of burning skin. His face twisted in supreme agony, the veins on his forehead bulging as if they were about to burst. Yet, those eyes remained resolute, blazing fiercer and more brilliantly than the inferno around him. Crack! The beam lifted. Using his free hand, he grabbed my belt and dragged my battered, broken body out of the death trap. Just before the propane tank in the kitchen exploded and blew off the roof, he hoisted me up and charged out the door into a blinding storm of ash. Boom! The moment Alexander carried me off the porch, the gas tank in the kitchen detonated. The shockwave hurled both of us onto the freezing snow in the yard. Thousands of debris fragments and embers shot into the night sky, vibrant and tragic like a bloody fireworks display, marking the end of my life's work. "Dad, Alexander!" Clara screamed, running over from the empty lot. She fell to her knees beside me, her blistered hands frantically checking my soot-covered face. Then she turned to Alexander. The shoulder of his suit jacket was burned away, the flesh underneath swollen and bleeding. He clenched his jaw against the pain, but the look he gave Clara held nothing but tenderness. Tusk, what a pathetic performance." A slow, dry applause echoed from the dark alleyway. Richard stepped out, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his expensive overcoat. Behind him stood two of his closest bodyguards. They casually admired the flames, reducing my family's legacy to ash. I have to admit, you're tough to kill, Thomas. Richard kicked a glowing ember by his feet, his tone dripping with sarcasm. But look around. Your rat hole is just a pile of ashes now. Tomorrow, I'll buy this wasteland for the price of garbage. Alexander slowly stood up to his full height. He wiped the soot from his face, and the lethal aura and authority of a cold-blooded corporate titan finally erupted. "You're not buying anything, Richard," Alexander said, his voice low and freezing. He raised his hand and pressed a small button on his wristwatch. Instantly, roaring engines tore through the night. 6 heavily armored black SUVs charged in, tires screeching, completely boxing in Richard's car. Dozens of blinding LED headlights switched on, pinning the culprit in a crossfire of light. Over 20 heavily armed men in black suits poured out. From the lead vehicle, Chief Counsel Miller stepped forward briskly. "Every second of your thug's arson was recorded by the thermal imaging cameras on this convoy," Alexander declared, looking down at Richard like a sovereign. "Before the sun comes up, I'll have you rotting in a cell and stripped of every asset you own." In the distance, the sirens of local police cruisers began wailing. A massive surge of hope flared in my chest. Richard was cornered. The villain was finally going to pay. But I was wrong. Contrary to the absolute panic I expected, after a few seconds of shock, the corners of Richard's mouth slowly curled up. He threw his head back and let out a maniacal laugh. "Billionaire Alexander Sterling, I know you're rich, but it seems you don't understand the rules of this godforsaken town." 3 local police cruisers tore through the snow and screeched to a halt at the scene. Police Chief Davis, a fat man with cunning eyes, stepped out. He didn't draw his gun on Richard. Instead, he walked over and patted Richard on the shoulder like an old friend. "What's all the commotion here, Mr. Richard?" Chief Davis jutted his chin. "Davis, you're right on time." Richard pulled out a cigar and lit it. He pointed straight at Alexander and me. "Old man Thomas went bankrupt and conspired with this homeless thug to burn his own diner down for the insurance money. They even tried to frame me." "What?" Clara screamed in outrage. "You lying bastard. Your men set the fire. We have video proof." Lawyer Miller instantly stepped up, holding out a tablet displaying the crystal-clear thermal footage of Richard's men pouring gasoline. Smack! Chief Davis swung his arm, violently slapping the tablet onto the snow, shattering it. He pulled his baton and glared. "Unverified digital evidence, clearly doctored. Confiscate all their vehicles. Arrest the homeless arsonist." Instantly, dozens of police firearms were aimed directly at Alexander. Alexander's security team immediately cocked their assault rifles, creating a terrifying standoff. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder. One wrong move, and a bloodbath would unfold right before our eyes. "Shoot," Richard sneered, stepping right into Alexander's face. "Do you dare let your guards open fire on local police? Do it, and you'll be an enemy of the state. This old man and his daughter will catch a stray bullet and die. In this town, your money can't buy my law." My heart plummeted into an endless abyss. Local authority was completely in Richard's pocket. They were a flock of vultures blotting out the sky. The sheer helplessness and injustice made me cough up a mouthful of blood. Alexander looked at me, then at Clara, who was trembling as she clung to my arm. He clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles cracked, but then he slowly raised his hands into the air. "Lower your weapons," Alexander ordered his team. "Stand down." "Mr. Chairman," Lawyer Miller cried out. "Follow my orders. Do not put this family in danger," Alexander roared. Chief Davis smirked, stepping forward to slap cuffs on Alexander, forcing him to his knees in the snow. Richard walked over crouched down to my eye level, and blew a thick cloud of cigar smoke in my face. "I told you, old man," Richard whispered, sounding like a demon from hell. "There are no miracles for scum like you. This billionaire brat is going to prison for arson. And your daughter, tomorrow morning, she'll have to crawl to my feet, begging for money to bury you." Clara collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. The night sky shattered. We had lost completely. Evil had once again arrogantly trampled over justice. The police roughly shoved Alexander toward the cruiser. But right before the car door closed, I saw Alexander turn his head. He wasn't looking at me, but staring intently at Lawyer Miller outside the perimeter. The corner of Alexander's mouth twitched into a cold, merciless smile. Through the window, I barely heard Alexander grind out his final order before being swallowed by the darkness. "Cut all contact with the state government. Call the FBI and the Treasury directly. Initiate the annihilation protocol. It's time to level this town." The wail of the ambulance siren tore through the freezing night, sending me into a deep coma. When I finally opened my eyes again, the acrid smell of ash was gone. Instead, there was the gentle scent of rubbing alcohol and the steady beep, beep of a heart monitor. I was lying in an intensive care unit, ICU, so brightly lit and luxurious that I thought I had gone to heaven. By the bed, Clara was sleeping, her blistered hands carefully wrapped in white gauze. Lawyer Miller stepped out from the corner of the room, bowing deeply. "Mr. Thomas, Mr. Alexander ordered a helicopter to fly you and Ms. Clara to the best private hospital in the state overnight. You are safe now." Hearing Alexander's name, my heart clenched. The local cops took him. "He's in danger." Miller pushed up his gold-rimmed glasses, a sharp, cold smile forming on his lips. "You don't need to worry about the chairman. You should worry about what's happening to them." Miller turned on the wall-mounted TV. The breaking news broadcast flashed in bright red letters. "The Purge. FBI raids and dismantles massive corruption and money laundering ring." On the screen, dozens of heavily armed FBI agents were swarming Richard's mansion. Chief Davis was shown, having his head shoved into an armored transport, his face chalk white, and Richard, the man who arrogantly stomped on the law last night, was now being dragged out in handcuffs, his face twisted in absolute panic. The news anchor announced clearly, Sterling Corporation had handed over a trove of classified data and frozen all of Richard's accounts. He was currently facing a $50 million tax debt and a life sentence. A brutal, flawless takedown. The villains had been ground into dust. Click. The hospital door opened. Alexander walked in. His shirt was in tatters, his shoulder wrapped in bloody bandages from the burns last night, but his aura of commanding authority was impossible to hide. Seeing him, Clara woke up. She took a step back, her eyes still guarded and hurt from the deception of his identity. Alexander signaled for Miller to leave, then slowly walked over to my bed. He didn't offer an empty apology. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, rusted bronze object, and carefully placed it in my palm. It was a badge engraved with a stalk of wheat, the old emblem of our diner from the very first days my wife opened it. My heart skipped a beat. My breathing hitched. Where did you get this? Do you really not recognize me, Thomas?" Alexander's voice was incredibly hoarse, his eyes rimmed with red. 15 years ago. On a freezing, snowy night exactly like last night. In that very same woodshed. The memories buried deep inside me suddenly burst open. 15 years ago, I found a 15-year-old boy, covered in slash wounds, dying in our backyard. He was being hunted by his own uncle over an inheritance. That night, I hid him in the cellar. My wife, who was severely ill at the time, handed me an envelope. It was our life savings, the money meant for her tumor removal surgery in the city the next morning. But looking at the dying boy, she smiled and nodded. I shoved the money and that badge into the boy's hands, pushing him through the fence. Catch the night train and get as far away as you can. You have to live, you hear me, kid? It was you, I whispered, tears spilling over. Yes. Alexander dropped his head by my bedside, his shoulders shaking. Thanks to that money, I fled to Europe, survived, and took back the Sterling Empire, but the price for my survival was your wife's life. My chest seized with pain. Because we gave the money to Alexander, my wife missed the critical window for her surgery and died 3 months later, leaving Clara and me in absolute poverty. Clara stood covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She finally understood the root of our tragedy. For years, I searched for your family to repay the debt, but the redevelopment zones had erased all traces. Until a few months ago, I accidentally saw you and Clara on a panoramic survey camera. Alexander looked up, his eyes swimming in tears. I gripped the badge tightly. Then why didn't you just bring the money? Why did you pretend to be a beggar and lie to us? Because I knew exactly how extreme your pride is, Thomas, Alexander said bitterly. My men reported that you once chased away a charity group with a broom because you refused to accept a handout. Think about it. If I walked in with a suitcase full of cash and said, I'm the kid who took your wife's surgery money, what would you have done? You would have seen it as blood money. You would have rather died, rather let the diner be foreclosed on, than ever accept a single cent from the person who indirectly caused the death of the woman you loved most. I was stunned. He was right. My pride and the grief of losing my wife would have made me throw him out. I had no other choice. Alexander gripped my frail hand tightly. I had to discard my identity and collapse on your porch once again. I had to become the lowest scum of society just to enter your home naturally. I needed to stay to secretly place a security detail around you, to protect you from Richard, and to gather the evidence to strip him of his power without crushing your pride. I didn't come to test you, Thomas. I came to make amends and to protect the only family that ever showed me mercy. A holy silence fell over the room. I looked at the powerful man crying before me. There was no resentment. The seed of kindness my wife had planted 15 years ago was not meaningless. It had become a guardian angel, returning at our darkest hour to save my life, and to bring Clara a man strong enough to protect her for the rest of her life. Trembling, I reached up and gently ruffled Alexander's hair, exactly the same way I had ruffled the teenager's hair all those years ago. You did good, kid, I smiled, tears cascading down my face. My wife. She would be so proud of you. The surgery lasted for 9 grueling hours. When I woke up, the first thing I felt wasn't the smell of antiseptic or the tangle of IV lines in my arms, but the strong, steady beating coming from my own chest. For the first time in years, I took a deep breath without agonizing pain tearing my lungs apart. The Grim Reaper's scythe had finally spared a miserable old man. Dr. Harrison walked in smiling, announcing that the artificial heart valve transplant was a complete success. With Sterling Corporation's world-class medical care, I could live a healthy life for at least another 20 years. 20 years, a span of time that had once been an unimaginable luxury while I lay coughing in the slums. 3 months after being discharged, I returned to the old plot of land. The site of our burned-down diner had been cleared completely, but Alexander didn't pave it over to build a mall or luxury condos like Richard had claimed. On the soil soaked with my family's sweat and tears, a beautiful 3-story building was nearing completion. A gleaming brass plaque by the gates read, Sterling Compassion Foundation, Community Support Center and Orphanage. In the bottom right corner of the plaque, a tiny wheat stalk was elegantly engraved, the symbol of the rusted badge from years ago. Alexander had used this land to build a safe haven for wandering souls, for the destitute left behind by society. He told me he wanted to turn my wife's sacrifice 15 years ago into an eternal lighthouse, illuminating the entire town that had once been shadowed by Richard's dark forces. As for Richard, he had received a life sentence and was rotting in a maximum security prison, never to see the light of day again. That spring, the sweet gum trees around town began to sprout new leaves, and that was also when I fulfilled the most sacred duty of a father. The grand cathedral in the city center was overflowing with white roses. Morning sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, casting vibrant rays across the sanctuary. The grand piano played a beautiful, melodic tune. I wore a meticulously tailored suit, although I still needed an engraved wooden cane to support my legs during physical therapy. I had never stood so tall and proud. Linking my arm, walking down the red carpet scattered with petals was Clara. My daughter wore the most breathtaking wedding gown, pure and radiant as an angel. The gaunt, resigned girl with grease-cracked hands was entirely gone. Clara's eyes now shimmered only with tears of perfect happiness. At the end of the aisle stood Alexander. He wore an ivory tuxedo, his hair neatly styled, his deeply affectionate gaze never leaving Clara for a single second. As we approached, Alexander took a step forward, bowing his head slightly in absolute respect to me. I gently lifted Clara's small hand and placed it into Alexander's large, steady palm. His shoulder, the same shoulder that had been scorched by fire to save my life, would now be the impenetrable fortress, shielding my daughter for the rest of her life. I am giving you the most precious treasure of my life, Alexander, I whispered, choking back emotion. I swear upon my life and my honor, Father. Alexander held Clara's hand tightly, looking straight into my eyes. There will never be another lie. Not a single tear of sorrow will ever fall on her face again. I will protect her with everything I am. The priest began to read the vows. In the quiet, solemn space, their I do's echoed, intertwining like the most perfect symphony of fate. I stepped back, quietly wiping a hot tear that had just rolled down my cheek. I looked up at the statue of Jesus on the high altar, then gazed through the glass dome at the deep blue sky. My love, up there, can you see? Our daughter is so beautiful today. My entire life, I thought I was the unluckiest, poorest man in the world. I used to resent fate, resent the poverty that robbed me of my gentle wife and suffocated my daughter's youth. But standing here in this light-filled cathedral, I suddenly realized a profound truth. Money, power, skyscrapers, they can all easily be reduced to ashes in a single night of fire. They are not true wealth. The greatest wealth a human can possess is kindness. It is a miraculous seed. 15 years ago, my wife planted a seed of goodness in the dead of winter, paying for it with her own life. That seed sprouted in the darkness, taking root through the storms, only to one day rise up and become a massive sheltering tree, spreading its branches to protect those she left behind. This world may be cruel, the rules of the strong may be unjust, but sincerity and love will always be the ultimate, supreme power. Because kindness is the only asset in this world, the more you give away, the more it multiplies.